This is the Venetian Windows quilt, and I'm excited to show this technique to you today. This is really my favorite technique to use with the Chenille-it blooming bias. And what we're going to be doing is raw edge applique on this quilt. All the designs on this quilt are done with raw edge applique and covered with the Chenille-it blooming bias. Let's take a closer look at this quilt so you can really see how it is done and the texture and the finish that it creates on the edge of these appliques. You can see around each of these appliques the texture of old-fashioned chenille. And it looks like you've done a lot of work. It looks like a complicated project, but is really very simple and easy to do. Let's take a look at just what you need to make this Venetian Windows quilt. This is a perfect quilt for a fat quarter collection. Here I'm going to start with a new coloration. This is Moda's Maven collection from Basic Gray. What you need is 40 fat quarters. You need 3 rolls of the 3/8 inch wide Chenille-it blooming bias, and we're only going to be using a single layer to finish these raw edges. So you're starting with fat quarters and Chenille-it. Move this out of the way. So you can see I've cut my blocks. Now the design for this quilt, for the Venetian Windows, is kind of a window pane open design, and you have an outside shape and you have an inside shape. And it's really fun to lay this out on your design wall or your floor once you get all your pieces cut out, because what you're going to do is, this was the original block. I had an outside piece and an inside piece. And then I'm switching out these inside pieces into another outside piece. And this is so I'm not doing full pieces of these center pieces. I have an outside piece and an inside piece and a back block. Now, a lot of people, when they do raw edge applique, like to use fusible web to put their applique down. I want the hand of my quilt to stay soft and supple, and I don't really need all that fusible web. That's another expense, and it's another step that I don't have to do. So what I am using instead is a water-soluble glue stick. Be sure you're using a water-soluble glue stick. This is just a inexpensive glue stick like you would buy for a child to use in school, because we want it to wash away when the quilt is washed. And all you need to do is take your appliques, you get your applique positioned where you want it on the quilt. Then I'm just going to take this water-soluble glue stick and just glue just the edges. I don't have to glue the whole thing. I pin it in position, and then I can just pull back different parts of it. Make sure that that glue stick, these edges just need to be down long enough for me to stitch them in place. So I'm just going to use that water-soluble glue stick all the way around. And once I have the outside piece glued down, then I'll take the inside piece, fold it back, do the same thing. Now you want to be careful when you cut out this block. Be sure, don't try and do it with a rotary cutter and do it fast. Take your time and very precisely cut it out, because these center pieces, when you switch them out, need to fit exactly in the center of the other piece. So take your time. If you do that, then you're going to have a real close finished edge on these pieces. They're going to butt up right next to each other. They're going to be very easy to stitch down and easy to cover with the Chenille-it blooming bias. You can see that I'm working on this quilt one block at a time. So I'm just working with a single block and the applique that goes on that block. The appliques on this piece have already been glued into place, so these edges are down nice and secure for me to cover up. The first thing I'm going to do is just stitch close to the edge before I apply the chenille. I want to make sure that these edges are caught. I'm using a 2.0 stitch length, a fairly short stitch length, and I am just going to go around this applique, pivot and turn at the corners. I'm probably about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge of this applique, and I want to stitch it down before I put the Chenille-it blooming bias on, just because then I don't have to be as careful, or I don't have to make sure that the chenille is stitching the edge down as well as the Chenille-it. So it's just easier and faster to do this first step. I'm not doing any other finishing on the edge of this applique except the row of stitching. I've already stitched the outside, completely stitched the outside edge down all the way around the edge of the applique. Now on the center you're going to have 2 raw edges, not just one. So I'm stitching first the beige raw edge, and I'm coming around to where I started that, and then I'm just going to stitch right over into the black, and now I am going to stitch around the raw edge of that black centerpiece all the way around the center. Now all the raw edges are stitched down on the applique onto our background block. I've just used a cream thread. That's not going to make any difference what thread you use to stitch this down because we're going to cover it up. And I'm going to start with the outside edge. Again, I'm using the 3/8 inch width of the Chenille-it blooming bias and just one layer. I'm going to start at one of my points. I just want to cover that edge up, and I'm going to stitch down the center of the tape. And then I'll show you what happens when we come to a corner. This is this is perfect bias, so going around those curves isn't a problem at all. There are 2 different ways you can do the corners. When I have a really sharp angle, if I have a 45-degree angle, I like to cut and turn. So I'm going to cut this about 1/8 of an inch beyond that finished edge. I can see about 1 inch before I get to that corner. And then I'm going to take the next piece and immediately lay that down. And I can hold that with my scissors so that when I come to that corner, just kind of keep that in place. So I'm just taking the second piece and going the next direction. Now this next corner isn't quite as sharp, so I can do this one of 2 different ways. I could cut that again, like I did on the first one, or I can simply flip this chenille to change the corner. And that's what I'm going to do on this corner, so you can see that you have a couple of options on changing the corners. So I'm just going to stitch down to where that's flipped, turn the corner, and keep going the other way. And as I'm laying this down, I'm just going slightly beyond that edge. Just make sure you're covering that edge, you know, maybe 1/8 of an inch beyond the edge, and curve that as you bring it around. And that's all there is to it. I'm just following the outline of my applique. This is a great way to do any raw edge applique quilt. And what it's going to do for your quilt is make that applique stand out. It's going to give it dimension. If you go to our Facebook page or our website, Instagram, you can see this quilt again. You know, take a minute and just take a look at this Venetian Windows quilt and imagine it without the Chenille-it blooming bias on it. It would not have the same, it wouldn't be as dramatic without this. The chenille is what really makes the shape of these blocks pop. So you can see, and I'm just going to do that all the way around the quilt all the way around the applique until the outside edge is finished, and then I'm going to do the same thing to the inside edge. All the blocks of my Venetian window quilt now are finished. They all have the chenille around all the appliques, and the blocks have been sewn together, so it's getting close to time to quilt. I wanted you to see what this finished block looks like with the chenille on it. Now you can see the chenille's on the outside edge, and it's covering those two raw edges on the inside. You can't see where those raw edges are. After the blocks are sewn together, there's another raw edge applique that goes onto this quilt, which is a diamond that goes over all your corners where your blocks are sewn together, and that will be finished the same way with a row of stitching and a row of Chenille-it blooming bias. I want to quickly tell you one trick that works on anytime you're doing a chenille quilt and you're doing raw edge applique, especially on this one where on the center you have two raw edges. When this is washed and dried and it blooms, maybe you didn't get as close to one of the edges as you should have, and a little bit of a raw edge is showing, but the chenille is so forgiving and it's so easy to fix. Anytime you have something like that, maybe this edge doesn't get completely covered when it's washed and dried. Even after it's washed and dried and fluffed up, I can just pull that fluffed edge part away and take a little piece of chenille where it's the length of where I can see my raw edge, stitch another piece of chenille down there, take a little wire brush, fluff it up, spritz it, throw it back in the dryer, and you'll never be able to see where I fixed that chenille. So enjoy using this new technique for your raw edge appliques, and let us see what you do on Instagram and Facebook.